Gary, Indiana. Here's the youthful Jackson 5.
All right, here we go. Series and Silliness Outcast. And I'm going to do a review of the interview of Suge Knight. He was recently on the Valuetainment podcast with PBD, Patrick McDavid, which is my favorite podcast besides mine, right? But the interview was basically over an hour long, and he called from prison because Suge Knight is actually doing 28 years for a fatal hit and run. And it was a little difficult to understand because he's calling on the phone, and the interview was about an hour long. So what I'm going to do in this is I'm going to break down the major points that happened. So, of course, the whole reason Suge Knight was on is because they wanted to talk about Puffy and all these allegations and the rumors that are floating around between him and Justin Bieber and so many other, artists that he signed and so on and so forth. And he had Suge Knight on because obviously Suge was in that music space during the 90s with Puffy. So that was one of the first things they talked about. And the question that PBD asked Suge Knight is, when you guys were out together, when you guys were, partying together, did you see any sexual behavior or any behaviors that were not of the norm? So just to fill you in, the rumors floating around for Puffy is that underage boys, the artists, like one of them was Usher. Usher was at his house when he was 13 years old. Justin Bieber at 14 years old. These are the rumors that are floating around. There's no proof. These are just the rumors that are floating around. So here's what Suge Knight's answer was, and the answer was extremely, extremely insightful. But before we move on, Suge Knight, for those of you who don't know, Suge Knight was the CEO and founder of Death Row Records. He actually produced The Chronic, and he produced with Dr. Dre, and he produced Doggy Style with Snoop Dogg. So in the 90s, he was a big name in the music industry. And then he went to prison, like I said, for a fatal hit and run. He's doing 28 years, and that's happened in 2015. So that's the basics. So here, the answer to the question was fascinating. Suge said, we have to stop looking just at Diddy. He goes, Diddy was a normal guy before he got into the music industry. And once he started rubbing elbows with big major music executives, he started mimicking their patterns. So these rumors didn't start with Diddy. This has been happening for basically years before him. And his mentors showed him, if you will, and then he showed the next generation. So then PBD asked, well, what names come to mind? And the first name he dropped two big names. And the first name he dropped was Clive Davis. Now, that was a bombshell because Clive Davis is one of the greatest music producers that ever lived. He is now currently 92 years old. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of his resume. So here is his resume. From 67 to 73, he was the president of Columbia Records. I apologize for looking down, but I wrote it down. He's the founder of Arista Records, and as of 2018, he is the chief creative officer of Sony Music Entertainment. Here is just a few names of artists that he produced: Tony Orlando, Sly and the Family Stone, Janis Joplin, Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Aerosmith, Pink Floyd, Whitney Houston, and there's many, many, many others. The other name that he dropped was Doug Morris. Doug Morris was the president of Atlantic Records in 1980. He became the president of Atlantic Records. And then he is, from 1995 to 2011, he is the chief executive officer of Universal Music Group. From 2011 to 2017, he was the CEO of Sony Music Entertainment. In 2018, he founded the record label 12 Tone. Now, again, there is obviously no proof. This is hearsay from the Suge Knight interview, but this is basically a record bombshell. So this behavior, according to Suge, has been going on for years. And he also generalized something. He said that if you take part in the secret room, then your career becomes better and better and better and better.
Opening with a medley of their hits that have sold over 1 million, each hit.
If you don't take part in the secret room, your career goes to crap. And that was a fascinating statement by Suge Knight. But there's a lot more to the interview as well. So Suge Knight basically was saying that this behavior is nothing new. This behavior is a cycle that's been happening within the music industry for decades. He mentioned two other names. The two names that he mentioned were Berry Gordy and Quincy Jones. I wrote it down, so I apologize if I'm looking down, but I'll try to do my best. Berry Gordy, founder of Motown Records, he discovered people like Stevie Wonder, Gladys Knight and the Pips, the Supremes, the Miracles, and the list goes on. He also mentioned Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones, another great music producer. He produced Thriller, Bad, Off the Wall. Now, Berry Gordy also produced the Jackson 5 and wrote music for the Jackson 5. Now, here's why I bring those two names up, because this is what Suge Knight said. Berry Gordy and Quincy Jones both worked with the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson, and both basically had their way with Michael Jackson when he was very young.
So where did Michael Jackson get it from? And you wouldn't have a problem to say, Berry Gordy was touching on Michael Jackson. You wouldn't have a problem to say that Quincy Jones was touching on Michael Jackson.
And this is a continuation, which is why Michael had those rumors floating around with young kids as he got older. Now, it gets even stranger. He claims that Berry Gordy knew Michael Jackson did not have a great childhood. His father was very strict. So Berry Gordy would buy him toys and kind of lure him in to be close to him. And he said it. He said it, and I quote, Berry Gordy was touching on Michael Jackson. And he also said it. Quincy Jones was touching on Michael Jackson. This is very disturbing, and what Suge Knight said is basically you have to stop the cycle somewhere. He goes, Puffy was not the first person to do this, but you have to stop the cycle. Go and watch the full interview. I mean, there's a lot to pull out from, but it is an amazing interview. And some of the stuff they touch on is kind of fascinating and offensive at the same time. So basically what Suge Knight is saying is that Puffy or P. Diddy is basically going to be the sacrificial lamb. He said it's a problem if you point the finger to Clyde Davis, if you point the finger to Berry Gordy, if you point the finger to Quincy Jones. But he is basically going to take the rap sooner or later. And PBD actually said that he spoke to a particular lawyer that said that what is going to happen to P. Diddy is going to be similar to what happened to R. Kelly. It's just a matter of time. Suge Knight basically said that this child abuse and this sexuality and sexual behavior in the music industry has been going on forever. Now, I just want to point out, this is purely speculation. This is what Suge Knight said in prison behind bars. Now, he was in the music industry as deep as you can get during the 1990s. But again, this is all speculation. None of it is proven, so on and so forth. But it is a fascinating interview coming from a guy who was in that space. So then PBD continues and says, is anybody protected? Does it still happen today with the social media that goes on? Does it still happen today? And Suge Knight said, nobody's protected. Nobody is protected. Everybody is vulnerable. And this has been going on forever. Now go and watch the entire interview, okay? Because it's a fascinating interview. I gave you what I believe to be the most important points that I pulled from that interview. But of course, they go on and they talk about Dr. Dre, and they talk about Death Row, and they talk about a little bit more than that. But the names and the points and the Puffy situation I pulled out and I'm giving to you. So please, again, like, share, subscribe to Serious and Silliness Outcast. I will be continuing to giving you content that's coming up just like this. And I love you guys. I appreciate every one of you guys. So enjoy the content that I put out, and later. Peace.